Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you, as always. A little bit of a different route today. The stage is looking very different, so I have to explain this to you. It's been a very unusual week here. We're celebrating percussion this week. Our percussion section, but also an incredible international percussion star and lots of guest percussionists. Yesterday, in fact, we had a full day of percussion for serious percussion students. They spent the entire day in Kleinhans taking master classes and then coming to the concert. And so it has been a very wild week and a wild repertoire as well, because we chose all the repertoire to feature percussion. So you'll hear that from all the pieces. And you'll notice that we have some percussion equipment set up in the front of the stage already. We have preset this. Actually, Evelyn Glennie has preset it. And we don't move it during the first half. So it won't be used for the Cuban Overture, the first piece. But the position of these instruments is so important for Dame Evelyn that she needs to have them here. So you'll notice that they're not in any use, but they're up here ready for the second piece. A great deal of what she does, and you'll notice this, involves her choreography, her traveling from one instrument to the other in a certain short period of time, being able to find the music and pick up the right mallets and be ready to play in these different stations. So she spent a lot of time with us this week finding the exact location that was perfect for her setup and going from place to place. So we do start with a piece by George Gershwin. Some of you have heard this before. It's a wonderful piece called Cuban Overture. George Gershwin, maybe our country's greatest composer. I mean, certainly someone that we are incredibly proud of. George Gershwin, in a way, had a sort of split personality. Part of him was the extraordinarily successful composer who wrote for Broadway, who wrote for Hollywood, who wrote the beautiful pop tunes that are part of our culture forever. And the other part was a George Gershwin who longed to be a classical composer and was a very serious composer. You might remember, I think I was telling you when we were working on the Ravel Piano Concerto, how Gershwin had met Maurice Ravel, and his dream was to actually study composition with Ravel. And Ravel refused to teach him, but probably recognizing that George Gershwin's natural talent was not something to interfere with. That this was an extraordinary, original artist. But nonetheless, George Gershwin persisted, and he was in his 30s at this point, and he was determined to learn more technique about composition. He was studying on his own the music of Stravinsky, of Prokofiev, of Alban Berg. He was very, very interested in his development, and he found a teacher finally in New York City. He was a Russian composer, had emigrated from Russia named Joseph Schillinger. And Mr. Schillinger had a very impressive group of people he was teaching, all drawn from the certain world. He was teaching composition to Tommy Dorsey, Vernon Duke, Benny Goodman, and Oscar Levant. So he was helping these people who are instinctively gifted learn how to refine their technique. So George Gershwin started to study with him. And the first piece he wrote under the tutelage of Mr. Schillinger was this Cuban Overture. And it does show more sophistication even than the works that we love. I mean, the great works he wrote, American in Paris and Concerto in F, which are fabulous. This work even shows a more refinement and even a greater sense of ease of using the symphony orchestra. In fact, I think there's really been no other composer who's been able to achieve this spectacular synthesis of jazz and in a classical setting, in a classical orchestra. Nobody else has really been able to do that with the absolute talent, skill, and grace as George Gershwin. This piece had its premiere on the first ever George Gershwin concert, all George Gershwin concert, and I really got a big kick out of reading this. This was August 1932. It was the first time that anyone had had the idea of, let's do a concert of all George Gershwin. We do that so often. We must have played hundreds of all George Gershwin concerts and loved them. And next year we're having 2 weeks of all George Gershwin, and we're really looking forward to it. But this was the first one, August 1932. The New York Philharmonic had the idea, okay, we're going to do a concert of all George Gershwin. And they did it at the Lewiston Stadium in New York. And George Gershwin wrote that it was the greatest night of his life. there were 18,000 people in the stadium cheering, and they had to turn away another 5,000 people. Can you imagine? So it was a good idea, I guess. So that's why we've been doing it all these years. But this piece opened the program, and then a couple of months later, they played the piece again at the Metropolitan Opera House. So it was a big hit. George Gershwin actually named it Rhumba. That was the original name, and you'll hear why. And then for some reason, at the second performance, they changed the title to Cuban Overture. But that's very fitting, too, because the piece actually came about, well, partly through his lessons with his teacher, but really more in his fantastic experience of going to Cuba for the first time in 1932. He paid a short visit to Cuba, and he was entranced by the music there. He was fascinated by the percussion instruments that he had never heard. These are instruments that were used in Cuba that we didn't use in the United States. So he actually bought some of these instruments, packed them up, and took them home with him. The claves, the bongo drums, güiro, and maracas. And he said, well, I'm going to use these. I'm going to use them in a piece. That's why he wrote this piece, to feature those Cuban percussion instruments. And he said, in the score, he wanted the conductor to have those percussionists up in the front, playing those instruments, right in front of the stage. Mostly it's not done that way, and we couldn't because of our setup for Evelyn, but you'll see them very clearly standing in the back. The inspiration for this piece, those Cuban instruments, and it's really a wonderful, evocative piece. And George Gershwin died only a handful of years later. He'd only lived a very short life. He died at 37. But it makes me think that if he hadn't died so young, what other wonderful music would we have today? And our American heritage would be so much enriched by this fantastic music. But we do have some wonderful music. So that's our first tribute to our percussion section in this Cuban Overture. Let me skip to the last piece on the program. This is a piece you might not know, but it's an amazing work, and I'm hoping that you're hearing it live maybe for the first time. It's by a Mexican composer named Silvestre Revueltas, a very important figure in Mexico. He also lived a very short life. He was born on the last day of the 19th century, December 31st, 1899, and died in 1940 at the age of 40 years old. And his life coincided exactly with the most tumultuous, difficult time, turbulent time in the period of Mexican history, 20th century Mexican history. The initial stirrings of revolution, the violence of the outbreak of revolution, and finally the consolidation of Mexico after the revolution. Those 40 years were an incredibly difficult time in Mexico. This violent phase of the revolution broke out in 1910, so he was still a young boy, and it ended in 1920, and then 20 years later after that, there was still a tremendous amount of tumult as the revolutionaries undertook the process of organizing a new government and a new constitution in 1917, which promised radical changes. And it was during this period, especially the 1930s, that Mexico saw sweeping changes, social changes. And that's when Revueltas was really flowering as a composer. He was writing music that reflected this time. He himself was a committed revolutionary. He was devoted to the Loyalist cause during the Spanish Civil War. He was one of the leaders of a group called Mexico's League of Revolutionary Artists. He was a very outspoken revolutionary. And as an artist, he became very political, and his aim was, first of all, fiercely nationalistic. But this nationalism had its root in a movement called indigenismo, which referred to the indigenous people of Mexico. That's who he was most interested in, Revueltas, the indigenous people, the Indian people, before the Spanish came to Mexico. And this piece is based upon that history, La Noche de los Mayas, the Night of the Mayas, one of the great Indian cultures of Mexico, and it is probably his best-known orchestral work. We know that of all the pre-Columbian people, the Mayas achieved the most astonishing height of intellectual achievement in astronomy, in literature, in architecture, in mathematics. They were amazingly advanced. And this was during the period, the Maya's period was 200 to 900 AD. Today, this surprised me, more than 1 million Mexicans still consider themselves Mayan descended directly from those Indians. The strange thing about the Mayans, and people wonder about this all the time, is they were very, very advanced in terms of scholarship and art as well. But they were incredibly brutal as well. Some of you know their practices, their pagan practices, their ceremonies were really frighteningly brutal. And Revueltas captures this in this piece. I'll tell you a little bit about those history because that's what his music is all about. And you need to really place him in this time of great turmoil in Mexico. He died, as I said, very young, at the age of 40 from alcohol-related problems. And he's the kind of person in his shadowy, difficult life that almost became, legends grew up around Revueltas. He was a hero during his brief life and a very, very important voice of the Mexican people. He was a child prodigy, a violinist, and a composer. He came to the United States where he studied in Chicago. He was a concertmaster in Texas, in San Antonio. He fought for the Republic in the Spanish Civil War. He was an extraordinary person, went back to Mexico, unfortunately lived in and out of mental institutions and died very young. So when he died in 1940, no one really knew him outside of Mexico. He was cherished as a hero of the Mexican people, but it wasn't until he had his centenary celebration in 1999 that the rest of the world began to hear the name Silvestre Revueltas and to understand that this music, this highly individual music, was astonishingly powerful. And this is an amazing piece, as you'll hear it. It stands right next to the masterworks of Stravinsky and Prokofiev in its intensity, in its vision. It's colorful, it's convulsive, it's frightening in spots, it's starkly original. I have to tell you that he was largely self-taught, so you don't hear any influences of Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven in this piece. You know, most composers go through and learn all the classical composers and romantic composers, and they learn from them. Revueltas did not. I mean, this music springs right from his imagination, or as one critic said, the music sounds like it was torn from his heart. That's how sort of violent and passionate it is. But it's completely his own voice. There's nobody else who wrote like him. He invented a new way of writing that's spectacularly diverse. It's almost like barely controlled chaos, and you'll hear that. In a way, this piece is almost like a Mexican rite of spring. That's the closest thing I guess I can compare it to. And if you imagine the people with whom he had close friendships at this time, the artists like Diego Rivera, those of you who've been in Mexico have seen those huge murals of the Mexican people, Frida Kahlo, these people who were also freedom fighters in their own way. The music mirrors that aspect of life. Their art is very similar to what he was trying to express in music. He is trying to express the soul of the Mexican people and this dichotomy of the Mexican people, their endless frustration and their joy at the same time. Their never-ending optimism, but their pessimism and their doubt that things will ever change. All of this contrast he expresses in his music. And he writes about the Mexican people with a profound empathy and a real love that you hear in this. So in the piece, there are 4 movements in this piece, which he wrote for a movie. At the end of his life, he was desperate for money, and he was writing movie scores for terrible Mexican movies. Terrible. I mean, you would never see these movies. He wrote music scores for 8 of them. The only good thing about them was his music. And this particular film, The Night of the Mayas, you can imagine what it was about. It was about culminated in some horrendous Mayan brutal ceremony. But the music that he wrote for this was really extraordinary. The first movement, he sets up this landscape, this duality of great beauty but also brutality behind that beauty. And you'll hear both of that in the first movement. The second movement, he takes right from the music of the land, the mariachi music. And you'll hear this. Everyone has heard a mariachi band. This is mariachi music that he writes for the orchestra. It's a very daring and original concept of orchestration that he has. You'll hear the importance of the trumpets, of course, a mariachi instrument, the clarinets, the tuba. He exploits extremes of registers. He has the instruments playing very, very high register or very low register. There's a certain kind of out-of-tune quality, which is in keeping with these village bands that he heard, the mariachi bands, a kind of asymmetrical, spontaneous rhythm, again, drawn right from the mariachi bands. So that's the second movement. The third movement is a beautiful lullaby. It's really very simple, very heartfelt, but it's interrupted by the fourth movement. And the fourth movement is called the Night of Sorcery, or the Night of Incantation. And it's this view of one of these terrifying ceremonies. Starts out with a tune in the oboe, like a religious chant, but very frightening. You'll notice the basses are playing what we have come to call a Bartok pizzicato, where they pull their string away from the fingerboard and they let it go. So you hear a slap as it slaps back on it. Ping, you know, this is all written for, Revueltas is calling for that, but you'll hear that special sound in the basses. We have actually, piece is not done very often because it calls for 13 percussionists. That's why it's on this program. 13 percussionists, and one of the people who's actually we borrowed him from our trombone section, Jeff D, who's our bass trombonist, is called upon to play the conch shell, because in this ceremony, which Revueltas researched, in the ceremony, the call to the ceremony was a conch shell. Well, some Indian would play this conch shell, and everyone would come to this ceremony. So Jeff is playing the conch shell, again, as called for by Revueltas, and using the kind of technique of Mayan drumming that he learned about. And it's one of the most powerful things we have in the orchestral literature. So this is a piece that is going to be very, very different from anything you've heard maybe in Kleinance for a long time. But it's quite overwhelming. And we're very proud of not only our percussion section, but all of the people who've come to join us. And all of this percussion was inspired by an incredible soloist in Evelyn Glennie, who's been here before, but she's here this time for a world premiere. So I asked Dame Evelyn to join me, and also our wonderful composer, Ewazen. So let's welcome them. Well, welcome to both of you. Evelyn has been here before, for Schwantner most recently, right, Schwantner? But this is Eric's first time with us, Ewazen. So yes. Welcome back to you. Welcome back. We're delighted that you're here. Now, this is a very special event because it is the first time we've played this piece that Eric wrote for Evelyn and for us. So it's amazing that we have the privilege of playing a new piece. So let me ask first, how did this come about? Where did the idea for this come from?
Sure. I had long heard of Evelyn Glennie's beautiful performances. I had seen her live in New York City. Years ago, she played with the New York Philharmonic, and there's this great artist. And then years later, I got a letter from her, an email from her, and she said in the email that she had been playing my marimba concerto, and that she'd enjoyed it, and I was so thrilled. And then she suggested that it might be fun to work together, which of course I was delighted about. So we, through emails, we communicated, and then, I suggested, well, maybe this could indeed be a big concerto, multi-movement concerto that explores not just the marimba, which is the big instrument over there, but it can explore other instruments. And so over a while, it's like, well, this will happen. But of course, we needed a great orchestra. And that's when we came up with the idea of working with JoAnn and the Buffalo Philharmonic, because your orchestra here has this amazing reputation for years and years, such a variety of music. Right now, I'm looking at the program this year, and I'm seeing all the new music by living composers. So we thought it might be nice to go to a JoAnn. And with our dear friend Penelope Prentice, who was friends with JoAnn and with the Buffalo Philharmonic members, helped bring us all together. And before you know it, we're here on the stage. So that's how it happened.
Now, Evelyn, when you commission a work, and I should tell you, this is extraordinary. Evelyn has commissioned over 170 works herself for percussion. Can you imagine how much she has enriched the repertoire for percussionists? It's amazing. You're like the patron saint of percussion.
And enrich my grey hair in the process, I think.
Well, this is what I was going to say. You know, when you commission a work, you're never sure what you're going to get.
Absolutely, and I think this is the intriguing thing about developing the repertoire for what is basically the oldest family of instruments, but yet somehow the development really started in the mid-20th century as regards to featuring percussion at the front of the platform. So we began seeing the emergence mainly of marimba concertos. And, you know, Darius Milhaud, the French composer, wrote the first ever percussion concerto back in 1927. So, you know, we don't yet have 100 years worth of solo repertoire. So most of the composers that I'm working with, you can actually email, can you believe? So that's quite interesting. But, you know, the process is always different from composer to composer. And of course now in the financial climate that we're in, often the commissions have to be shared experiences whereby several composers, several orchestras or promoters have to come into play. And although that, the good side of that is that obviously you then have several performances of the piece of music by different conductors in different types of venues with different orchestras. But it takes a lot longer to schedule that type of thing in order to fit into each orchestra's schedule. But nevertheless, I mean, this has just been a hugely rewarding experience, and it's something I'd like to continue with.
For us too, and I think both of us had a little bit of anxiety about would you be happy with how we were performing it and what would you think? Because tell us, Eric, when you hear the piece in your head, of course, when you're writing it, but the first time you hear it physically, it was that first rehearsal here.
Yes.
What did you think? Were you nervous?
Beforehand, absolutely. I'm on the plane coming from New York City, my home. I'm looking at the score, and I'm second-guessing myself. I'm looking at some of the instruments. I'm wondering, balance, is this going to work out? Are the kinds of instruments that I'm using, will this sing? Will this, have I given the percussionist a nice variety and a balance between these various instruments? There are all these things in my mind, and yet, of course, I know these are great artists. They're gonna make anything work, but still, you know, I'm looking at the music and wondering, what is it really going to sound like? And yes, I am scared. I am scared.
Well, we were all scared.
But for pretty much every big piece. Now, when I say big piece, where you're dealing with a lot of different instruments, and also something when it's the very first time, I have never written for xylophone before. This was the very first piece that I wrote for xylophone. I hadn't even used it as an accompaniment in an orchestra piece, and it was the first time that I had written an extended solo for the glockenspiel, which is the high bell sound at the far end. So when I heard the first rehearsal, I'm sitting there with the score, and then I relaxed. I said, this is really cool. And I just loved seeing how Evelyn was being so expressive with the music, how JoAnn seemed to just be working just in tandem. And at today's concert, watch how the two of them interact and feel the music together. And then that's bringing my music, the notes, to life. And so it was a thrill. That first rehearsal.
Eric has been smiling all week since then, so
right.
It's made us happy.
Right.
But now I'm going to ask Evelyn, because you'll hear this piece. It's a very special inspiration for the piece, based really upon your heritage, your Scottish heritage. How did that come about? Did you make that suggestion of
Yes.
Well, and how do you feel about having a piece really written based upon your background?
Oh, I feel very honoured indeed, and I knew that Eric's music is extremely melodic, and so the idea, which was your idea, about basing it on something Celtic and then basing it on some of the poetry by Robbie Burns, this was really intriguing for me, and I knew that, heavens, this piece could be a very useful piece further down the line, because of course you can commission all you want, but it's really important that other players have an opportunity to play the repertoire, and the repertoire really does have a long shelf life, long after I'm able to play these pieces. So this is really very, very special indeed. And then, of course, it was your idea to then recite the poetry.
Well, this is because I love Evelyn's accent so much. Right, which I've told you. Well, I had in the score the 4 Robert Burns poems that you had selected. And I read them. I thought, this is wonderful. Well, will our audience know what inspired the piece? So I said to Evelyn, maybe you should actually read them in the concert. And then I think you had a better idea. We taped Evelyn reading the poetry. So you're going to actually hear over the sound system her reading each poem, and then we go right into the music so that you can tell what it was about. One of the most charming ones is the second movement. I think this is so charming, where the poem is about a fiddler who is debating whether he should sell his fiddle because he'd like to buy a bottle of wine. And does he do it at the end? Does he sell his fiddle? No.
No way.
Well, so Eric had the idea of a duet for that movement only, of bringing up Michael, our concertmaster, to play next to Evelyn. And it's really, it's amazingly authentic fiddle playing and accompanied by Evelyn and percussion. It's great. And another thing that surprised me about the piece is I thought, and these melodies seemed so Scottish, so Celtic, and I said, well, these must be tunes that you borrowed. And I happened to mention to you offhand, asked him what the names were, and he said, well, they're all mine. They're all original.
Yes, they are original. There's one a tune where I have an homage to Robert Burns because some of his poems, and when you read them, they're actually songs, and either he did them to pre-existing melodies or traditional tunes. Sometimes the tunes came about in tandem, and so there's one of his most famous ones, other than Auld Lang Syne, which is of course the top tier. He has a poem called "My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose," and that da-da-dum. I see some people nodding that know the tune. Da-da-da, my love is like a red, red rose. So I took that tune but made it fast. So you're going to hear it in the vibraphone. Da-da-dum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-dum. Turn it into a dance, but still, it's my hats off to Robert Burns. But other than that, the melodies are my own, but they're influenced by Scottish rhythms. There's something you're going to hear which is called a Scottish snap. That's what we call it. Do you use the same term? Yeah, which is kind of a short, long, da-dum, da-dum, that type of rhythm. And so I use that. I use some particular types of melodic stylings or shapes that are traditional to Scottish folk tunes. But they are original tunes.
Well, and very charming. I want to ask Eric one final question, because I was so charmed by this when he told me. Someone asked you, when did you decide to be a composer? And he told me he was about 7, but this is why.
Well, I think this is when I decided to become a composer. I was a youngster, the baby boomer generation, and the kids on my block all suddenly went to this teacher. Our parents found out that there was a piano teacher, so we went to her, started taking lessons. For me, it was great fun. And after about a year or 2, I kept at it, and I did my practicing. And then one week, I had this piece. It was like a simplified version of a Beethoven I think it was a bagatelle, and I remember practicing it, and it was in the key of B flat. And even for non-musicians here, of course we have different notes, and the B flat, the notes are B flat, C, D, E flat, F. Well, I was playing it with B flat, C, D, E natural, F. So I was playing it not E flat, but regular E. And I thought, this is one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever heard. And I'm practicing it away and saying, I love this. And then I go to my lesson and the teacher, oh, that's good, Eric. But that's an E flat. You better play it different. I didn't like that at all. And I thought, this isn't. And then I was so disappointed to find out that I couldn't just change the note, that it was Beethoven. So I think that's when I wanted to do it my own way. Yeah.
Well, and he's composed countless pieces your own way with enormous success. Tell us, just answer the same question for us, Evelyn. When did you know that percussion was for you? You started very young as a child.
Well, I started timpani and percussion from the age of 12 through the school system in Scotland. And really it wasn't until the age of 15 that I decided to become a musician. So it was a wee bit later. And well, I don't know. It was just one of those things whereby you just had to make a decision as to what you wanted to do. And but I kept the aim really simple in that I just wanted to concentrate on solo percussion. And if that was not possible, then I'd do something else, probably be a vet or something.
Well, not only was it possible, it's been glorious for all of us when Evelyn has played all around the world, many, many pieces to spectacular acclaim, and she's really a superstar, and we're very honored to have her here. So you're in for a real treat, and we hope you enjoy Eric's new piece as much as we do, and thank you for being with us this afternoon.